Hi listeners and welcome to the latest Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So as I said, we are footnoting again, and we're footnoting on a topic that I know, well, nothing about, I'd also not heard of it, and you have for a while now said we should do Tolkien's on fairy stories, and I still don't know. That's all I know about it. That's what it's called.
Okay.
So this is
you're obviously normally when we do these, one of us is merely pretending not to know what we're talking about. But right now, you will literally not know what you're talking about. Great. You'll play the choric role well then, Chris.
Well, yes, I don't know. I mean, I know that we sort of having completed, I should say, our Lord of the Rings trilogy. This very much comes out of that, and I think it was an idea that you had to then do in response to us having finishing the three films. But I don't know the intricacies of it and how it kind of relates to some of the stuff that we talked about. And so I will be sitting here. I'm now the student in this 10-minute office hour.
Okay, so should we start with what is it?
Yes, let's do that.
Fine. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories is a kind of it's a seminal kind of essay in fantasy scholarship. It's an essay that is often cited by contemporary academics, particularly within the literary field, and it is written by none other than, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien himself, him of Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth and all that stuff.
Yep.
It was originally delivered as a lecture as part of the Andrew Lang series of lectures at the University of St Andrews in 1939, and it's popped up in a variety of different collections ever since. The one I'm referring to today comes from the collection, it's called, I actually don't have it to hand, but something like Monsters. Should have worked that one out, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
I'm not going to cut this out, everyone, because sometimes academics do things on the cuff, and you need to know about that. It's called something like The Monsters and the Critics and Other Essays. That's it. But it's also published in another couple of different thing. So it's an essay about fairy stories written by J.R.R. Tolkien, him of Lord of the Rings and that.
Okay, so fairy, my first, and this is now with me adopting my fantasy hat on, as I very rarely do, but occasionally do. Fairy is in F-A-I-R-Y rather than F-A-E-R-I-E.
Very good question, Chris. So in the essay, Tolkien basically says he's going to answer three questions. Okay, so as long as we try and answer these three questions, we'll have done our job.
Okay.
What are fairy stories? What is their origin? And what is the use of them? Okay. And because he's an academic, he spends far more time doing the third thing than the first two things, which he kind of gets through quite easily. But to answer your question, what are fairy stories? He kind of skims through various accounts of where this term fairy came from, and he comes to the conclusion that when people say fairy stories, they do not mean stories about fairies, but rather something wider, something more encompassing. And actually, the way he seems to use it is a kind of tradition of fantasy literature, which is a bit different to, I guess, how we would use the term today. Most people who use the word fairy story today would refer to kind of folk stories, fairy tales as a kind of demarcation from modern fantasy literature. Here, Tolkien seems to be using the word fairy to talk about the whole history of kind of marvelous literature, of literature about the fairy, F-A-E-R-I-E, the kind of the nature of fairy. He says, indeed, fairy has many ingredients, but analysis will not discover the secret of the whole. Fairy itself may perhaps most neatly be translated into the term magic, but if it is magic of a particular mood and power, the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. So not magic in the VFX sense of the word, but magic in the kind of peculiar mood and power. Stories about magic.
Okay, so I mean, I wasn't aware that that Tolkien was an academic or had that sort of sensibility, insofar as I was kind of making that link between him giving a lecture or him writing Lord of the Rings. So this comes.
So he's an Oxford professor. Remember, he is an academic. He's not an academic of fantasy.
Right.
He's an academic of linguistics. And the whole point of Lord of the Rings is that he's a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature, of Anglo-Saxon mythology, of ancient languages. And the famous story of Lord of the Rings is he invents the languages and then he invents the world to fit the languages. So he is a professor of linguistics, but this is not necessarily him on his home turf, but he's certainly used to writing an academic essay or two in his time. So,
right.
Yeah.
And where does this come in relation to? And this is really me showing my ignorance. So where does this come in relation to the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit? Because it took me a long time to work out that the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings were different books. Are they different? They're different books? Are they? Yes.
They're very different. Yeah, they're different books.
Okay.
Different books.
And also, I know that he wrote on Beowulf as well, and obviously that was a very popular, if slightly uncanny, computer animated film from 2007 that uses kind of motion capture and stuff, but and he writes that in 1936. So give me a little lineage of how this fits in. Is he responding to his writing in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings? Is this anticipating his writing that he would do in those novels?
I'm furiously Googling just to make sure I've got my facts right, but listeners, by all means, write in and complain if I haven't. So he gives the essay is first published in 1939.
Yep.
He first gives the lecture in 1936, and The Hobbit is first published in 1937. So it's he's giving the lecture probably at the time he's finished The Hobbit or is about to finish The Hobbit, and it's about to be published. Lord of the Rings is a sequel to The Hobbit, and it comes out a few years later, in the 40s sometime, he says quickly. Look, in the 50s. 54, of course it does. 1954.
Right.
So it's a big, long, gestating sequel to what's nominally a children's book, The Hobbit, and this essay is written whilst and during and in reflection of his writing on The Hobbit.
Right, okay then. So this is in conversation with some of his thinking at the time around The Hobbit and presumably other kinds of work that relates to, thinking of all the terms that we've touched on that could be footnotes in their own terms, wonder, the marvelous, imagination. It seems like Tolkien's interested in these things.
Yes, he's absolutely interested in these things. It is an essay, as I said, that tries to answer these three questions, but, and to repeat them, they are, what is a fairy story? We've done that one already. Where is their origin? He's not really actually interested in that. He kind of does a couple of paragraphs on where they might come from, and then concludes that really there's no point in tracing the lineage of it. What you really need to do is think about it as a kind of state of mind, as a kind of mode of fantasy.
Yep.
And then he spends almost half the rest of the essay talking about that third question, which is what is the use of them? Okay?
Yeah.
And that's where he sort of starts to create a number of terms and a number of ways of articulating the way fantasy should be written and the way fantasy should be read that are still influential in literary theory today.
Yeah.
I should say, though, ask me a follow-up, and I'll say what I'm going to say when I have to say it.
So it seems to me that Tolkien is very much interested in, rather than being in the fantasy fiction, he's in the fantasy auditorium. Like, he's interested more in spectatorship and the feel and the effects of fantasy and how we engage with it.
Well, you use the word spectator, and that implies kind of film to me.
Yeah, I was trying to. No.
He's definitely not interested in that. He is interested in the writing of literature. In fact, there's a really famous passage, or at least in my head, a very famous passage in this thing, where he says that the craft of fantasy or the art of fantasy is a thing best left to words. In fact, I can quote: "Fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. In painting, for instance, the visible presentation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it, and silliness or morbidity are frequent results." So he doesn't like fantasy in art. He's famously very prickly about the idea of Lord of the Rings getting adapted to the big screen. This is an essay about the craft of writing fantasy, and I should stress that's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit agnostic on this piece, because I'm obviously a film scholar first and foremost, and I also what it also is it's a defense of fantasy. It is one of those essays, and you've encountered these as an animation scholars, where a good chunk of it is spent him telling people that it's not just for kids, that it's not just trivial, it's serious, it's worthwhile, it's something serious men, and he probably does mean men, do. And this is how they should do it for it to be serious. So he's very interested in how one crafts a fantasy story that is serious, that is worthwhile, and that can be appreciated as art.
Okay. Oh, so he is sort of interested in sort of structure, but through the lens of craft.
Yes, not so much structure, but world building. And this is
World
where
building,
you're going to love it, because this is very much up your alley. Again, this is something I'm not particularly interested in, but, well, not that I'm not interested in, I don't necessarily buy what he's saying, but to say what he says, what he basically argues in this kind of big section on what the use of fantasy is he argues against the old Coleridge thing about willing suspension of disbelief. And the idea that fantasy is about, art and fantasy is about this willing suspension of disbelief. And instead what he comes up with is this theory of what he calls subcreation. So it's the idea that fantasies appeal, and the thing you do as a fantasy writer is to subcreate, is to create a secondary world which the mind can enter into. And if a writer does that properly, it allows the reader to engage in a process that isn't the suspension of disbelief, but what he calls secondary belief. Mm-hmm. You with me still?
Yeah. This has been...
Okay.
Yep.
Right, so these are terms that have kind of echoed throughout world-building theory, these are big terms, and it's an essay that's only about 40 pages long, so he kind of throws these things out there and kind of we're left to kind of think about the possibilities of them. But what he means by secondary belief is the idea that things can be true in certain contexts, even if they are not true in other contexts. So I think he uses an analogy once about cricket. It's quite a flippant analogy, but I think it's quite a helpful one, which is the idea that, in the game, it makes sense if you are watching cricket. I wish I knew more about cricket at this point, but it makes sense when the wicketkeeper catches the ball before the batsman gets over the line to say that someone is out in a way that is not true if they're walking down the street. Within the game of cricket, things can be true that are not true when cricket isn't being played. And he's sort of making that point about this idea of fantasy. If a secondary world has been created, has been sub-created properly, things can be true and false, and the reader can engage in secondary belief while they're reading it, so that it's not about the willing suspension of disbelief, it's about engaging secondary belief. But that can only happen if the writer has crafted a successfully, logically consistent world where things have been sub-created effectively.
Yep. No, absolutely. And actually, this is, this writing, I hadn't really put two and two together, but this work is foundational to writing on fictional worlds. Mark J.P. Wolf's book, Building Imaginary Worlds, with the subheading, The Theory and History of Subcreation, has a whole section in his chapter, I think, Worlds Within Worlds, which is about secondary worlds and secondary kind of, basically new forms of belief, and cites directly Tolkien in secondary belief and the idea of kind of consistency, and this is so this is you're right, I did love it.
Yeah, I thought you would. I know we're out of time, but I think my thorny caveat is that I don't really I never like using the word belief particularly when it comes to fantasy. So I'm not convinced by this, but hey, others are. Loads of people who I respect tremendously and whose works are really great, and we will now cite, and people should go off and read. It's an incredibly influential essay. We haven't had time to talk about all the other things he talks about, but hey, people should go and read it, because it basically is a foundational text on the history of world building, and who better to write the theory of world building than the guy that created Middle-earth.
Excellent. We are a couple of minutes over time, but is there anything that responds to this? I mean, has it been influential? Is there scholarly writing on this, apart from Wolf, something like Wolf and building imaginary worlds that is kind of fictional worlds in its tone? What else is there that people can go and find?
Wolf's a really good one. Farah Mendelssohn's Rhetorics of Fantasy, with the immersive fantasy riffs on Tolkien quite a lot in there. I should say that the essay itself can be found in The Monsters of the Critics and other essays, as well as a book called Essays on Charles Williams. It's an odd title, but you'll find it in there. And loads more that escape me, but it's there aren't many fantasy literary theorists, at least, that don't at least engage with this a little bit.
Brilliant. There we go then. Done and dusted.
All right. We're done and dusted, leaving Middle-earth behind, and I guess we'll see you next time. Oh, if people have suggestions for a future footnote, fananim research, FANANIM research @gmail.com. We're delighted to receive them. Otherwise, we'll see you again.
Bye.